He only came to the small seaside cafe for a quiet breakfast with his daughter, until a beautiful brunette waitress took his little girl's hand and unknowingly changed the life of a millionaire CEO forever. Jonathan Reed had always been a man who thrived in the structured precision of his own world. At 33, as the CEO of a major investment firm, his days were built on routines so finely tuned that there was little room for error or surprises. His sharp brown eyes missed nothing in a meeting room, and his dark hair, neatly styled, complemented the clean lines of the tailored blue suits he favored. In public, he projected a calm, decisive authority that made people trust him with their money, their businesses, and sometimes even their futures. But that morning, as he drove along the winding coastal road with his 5-year-old daughter Lily in the back seat, he wasn't thinking about contracts or quarterly reports. The sea stretched out to the horizon on his right, glittering under the pale sunlight, while to his left, grassy hills rolled gently toward the town they were approaching. It was a place he hadn't visited in years, a small, picturesque seaside community where he and his late wife had once spent summers. He'd promised himself he would bring Lily here when she was old enough to remember it so she could see a piece of her mother's world. Lily sat quietly, her fair hair catching the sunlight, her small face pressed against the glass as she watched the scenery go by. She was curious by nature, always asking questions, always noticing details. Today, however, she was unusually silent, perhaps sensing the weight of the visit. Jonathan reached over at a stoplight, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "We'll be there soon, sweetheart," he said gently. She nodded, offering a small smile. By the time they pulled into the heart of town, the streets were busy with weekend shoppers and tourists. Jonathan parked near the square, intending to stretch their legs before they went to see the old beach house. The smell of fresh bread drifted from a corner cafe, and he suggested they stop for something to eat. Lily's eyes lit up at the thought of a snack, and within minutes they were stepping into the warm, inviting space. The cafe was modest but charming, polished wood floors, sunlight streaming through wide windows, the low hum of quiet conversations. A chalkboard menu hung behind the counter, its handwriting a little uneven but friendly. Jonathan led Lily to a small table by the window, helping her into her seat before glancing at the menu. He set his phone on the table, intending only to check messages quickly, but a flood of urgent notifications from his office pulled his attention in deeper than he intended. It was only a couple of minutes, 3 at most, but when he looked up, Lily's chair was empty. For a split second, he thought she might have gone to the counter, but the space was clear. His heart slammed against his ribs. He scanned the room, his breath catching when he didn't see her immediately. The cafe seemed to shrink around him, the pleasant chatter fading into the pounding of his own pulse. "Lily?" His voice was sharper than he meant it to be, drawing the attention of a few nearby patrons. Panic crept in, cold and unwelcome. He pushed back his chair so fast it nearly tipped, already moving toward the door. And then he saw her, standing just inside the entrance, her small hand wrapped gently in the hand of a young woman in a waitress's uniform. The woman had warm brown eyes and dark hair pulled back neatly, her expression calm but watchful. She crouched slightly beside Lily, speaking to her in a soothing tone, before guiding her toward him. Relief hit him so hard he almost staggered. In that moment, Jonathan didn't see the carefully controlled world he'd left behind in the city. He saw only his daughter, safe, and the stranger who had found her before the fear could turn into something worse. Jonathan closed the space between them in a few quick strides, his relief spilling into motion before words could form. He knelt down in front of Lily, resting his hands lightly on her small shoulders. "You scared me," he said softly, trying to keep his voice gentle, despite the adrenaline still rushing through him. "Where did you go?" Lily glanced toward the display case near the entrance, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to see the cakes." Jonathan let out a breath that was half a laugh and half a sigh. "Next time, you tell me first, okay?" She nodded and he kissed the top of her head before standing to face the woman who had brought her back. Up close, Jonathan noticed details he hadn't registered in the initial rush. Her dark hair pulled neatly into a ponytail, a faint trace of flour dusting one sleeve of her uniform, the quick, assessing look in her eyes as she studied him in return. "Thank you," he said, the words heavier than they sounded. "I don't know how far she would have gotten if you hadn't seen her." The woman smiled faintly, shaking her head. "It's no trouble. I have a niece about her age. I can spot that lost look from across the room." She extended her hand. "Sophia Bennett." Jonathan Reed, he replied, taking her hand briefly. Her handshake was firm but warm. And this is my daughter, Lily. Sophia crouched slightly to Lily's height. Hi, Lily. I like your dress. It's very pretty. Lily smiled shyly, hiding half her face behind her father's leg. Sophia's smile softened, but she didn't push, turning her attention back to Jonathan. Would you like me to bring you both some menus? We've got fresh blueberry muffins today. Kids seem to like them. That sounds perfect, Jonathan said. Sophia disappeared toward the counter, moving with the easy efficiency of someone who knew the space by heart. Jonathan watched her go, feeling a flicker of something he couldn't quite place, an awareness that went beyond simple gratitude. He shook it off, focusing on getting Lily settled again. When Sophia returned with menus and 2 glasses of water, she set them down and lingered just long enough for a few more words. You're not from around here, she said matter-of-factly. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, a trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. That obvious? The suit, she replied with a hint of amusement, nodding toward his neatly pressed jacket. And the way you looked at the menu, like it was a contract you needed to negotiate. Jonathan chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since Lily had wandered off. I suppose I deserve that. Sophia's tone grew gentler. This is a small town. People notice things, but that can be a good thing, especially when you need someone to notice your daughter before she walks too far. Her words struck him with a quiet truth. In the city, people rarely looked up from their own lives, their own phones. Here, a stranger had seen his child's uncertainty and acted without hesitation. As they placed their order, muffins for Lily, coffee for him, Jonathan found himself asking questions. Have you lived here long? All my life, Sophia said. I run this place with my aunt. It's nothing fancy, but we know most of our customers by name, and we like it that way. There was no boast in her tone, no defensiveness, just a simple pride in the life she had built. Jonathan envied for a moment the steadiness of it. His own life was anything but simple. When the food arrived, Sophia set the plate in front of Lily and leaned down slightly. If you want to see the cakes again, I'll show you after you finish eating. But your dad comes with you, deal? Lily giggled and nodded, her shyness easing. Jonathan caught Sophia's eye, silently thanking her for making the moment light instead of awkward. As Sophia moved away to tend to another table, Jonathan found himself watching her again. Her easy smile with regular customers, the way she bent down to listen to an elderly man's order, the efficiency with which she cleared a table without seeming rushed. She was comfortable here, in her own space, and something about that grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. It had been years since anyone had stepped into his day uninvited and left him feeling better for it. And though he didn't know it yet, this wasn't the last time Sophia Bennett would change the course of his life. Lily had finished most of her muffin, crumbs scattered across the small plate, when Jonathan noticed she was beginning to fidget with the paper wrapper instead of eating. She'd already stolen 2 curious glances toward the display case, and a faint smile tugged at his mouth. All right, he said, leaning closer to her. Want to see those cakes again? Her eyes lit up instantly. Yes. He pushed back his chair, glancing toward the counter where Sophia was refilling the sugar jars. Looks like we need an official tour, he said as they approached. Sophia looked up, amusement in her eyes. Tour, huh? Well, you've come to the right guide. Follow me. She led them to the glass case, pointing out each dessert with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who actually cared about what she served. That's our lemon tart. My aunt makes it from scratch. Those are chocolate eclairs, and the carrot cake. Well, that's my personal favorite. Lily pressed her hands against the glass, studying everything as if it were treasure. They're all so pretty, she said with a small sigh. Sophia crouched beside her. Sometimes pretty things taste the best, but sometimes the simple ones surprise you more. She nodded toward a plain-looking apple pie in the corner. That's been here since this morning, and it'll be gone before closing. People drive in from 2 towns over just to get a slice. Jonathan found himself watching the way Sophia spoke to Lily, not in the overly sweet tone adults sometimes used with children, but as though she truly respected her curiosity. It was a rare quality, and it stirred something in him. They returned to the table, Lily chattering softly about her favorites. Sophia followed with a check, though she hesitated before setting it down. You said you're visiting, she began. If you don't mind me asking, What brings you to our little corner of the coast? Jonathan's fingers stilled on his coffee cup. For a moment he considered giving a vague answer, something about a weekend getaway, but the openness in her expression made him choose differently. I used to come here a lot, he said slowly. Years ago. My wife and we spent summers in a house just outside town. She loved it here. Sophia nodded gently, sensing the shift in his tone. And your daughter? She's never been, he said, glancing toward Lily, who was happily drawing shapes in the condensation on her water glass. I wanted her to see the place, to have some kind of connection to it. Her mother passed away when she was just a baby. This town is the closest thing I can give her to those memories. The hum of the cafe seemed to fade for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. Sophia's voice when she spoke was soft but steady. That's a beautiful thing to do for her. Hard, maybe, but important. Jonathan met her eyes, a flicker of gratitude there. Most people don't call it beautiful. They call it dwelling on the past. Most people haven't lost what you have, she said simply. Sometimes holding on is the only way to keep moving forward. He hadn't expected understanding from someone he'd met less than an hour ago. But there it was, uncomplicated, without pity. He found himself wanting to ask her about her own life, about how she came to speak with such certainty about loss. But Lily interrupted with a question about whether they could visit the beach before going home. We'll see, he said, ruffling her hair. Sophia smiled at the exchange, then straightened. Well, if you do go, the South Shore is the nicest this time of year. Fewer people, calmer waves. Easier for kids. Jonathan tucked the tip under the check and stood, offering his hand in thanks. I appreciate everything, especially what you did earlier. Sophia shook his hand, and for a brief second, neither of them let go immediately. It was nothing, she said, though her eyes told him she understood exactly how much it had meant. As he walked Lily out into the crisp air, Jonathan caught himself glancing back through the window. Sophia was already at another table, laughing at something a customer had said. But for reasons he couldn't explain, he had the feeling that this wasn't the last time he'd see her. And somewhere deep down, he knew he didn't want it to be. The next morning, Jonathan decided to take Lily for a walk through the town square before visiting the old beach house. The air was cool but bright, and the scent of fresh bread and salt water mingled in a way that reminded him why his wife had loved this place. Lily skipped ahead a few paces, her small hand occasionally brushing the shop windows as she peered inside. They passed the cafe, and without thinking, Jonathan slowed. Through the wide front window, he saw Sophia wiping down tables, her dark hair falling forward as she leaned over. She was speaking to a customer at the counter, her expression animated, her smile unguarded. Jonathan felt a strange pull, a curiosity that had nothing to do with her being the woman who had returned his daughter the day before. It was something quieter, but just as insistent. Before he could second-guess himself, he pushed the door open. The bell above it chimed, and Sophia looked up, surprise flickering across her face before settling into a warm smile. Back so soon? She said, setting aside her cloth. I promised Lily we'd stop in before we head to the beach, he said. Lily was already making her way toward the display case, her eyes locked on the apple pie Sophia had mentioned yesterday. Sophia came around the counter, leaning down to Lily's level. Pie for breakfast? She teased. Lily grinned. Daddy said maybe. Well, Sophia said, glancing at Jonathan with a playful arch of her brow, I think maybe can mean yes if it's a special day. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head, but didn't object when Sophia cut a small slice and set it on. Eat plate. They took a table by the window again, sunlight pooling on the worn wooden surface. The cafe had just started to fill when the door opened, and a man in a charcoal suit strode in, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Jonathan. He walked straight over, carrying a sleek leather folder. Mr. Reed, sorry to interrupt, but we need your signature on the revised acquisition terms. The board is waiting for confirmation before the markets open. Sophia, clearing a nearby table, froze for a moment at the man's words. She glanced over, her eyes narrowing slightly as if processing what she just heard. Jonathan took the folder without looking flustered. He scanned the documents, signed them quickly, and handed them back. Tell them I'll review the final projections tonight, he said. The man nodded briskly and left as abruptly as he'd arrived. When Jonathan looked back, Sophia was still watching him, though she quickly turned away to gather plates from another table. He could almost feel the shift in the air, something unspoken sliding between them. He waited until she passed their table again. You heard him, he said evenly. Sophia set the plates down at the counter and came back, leaning one hand on the edge of their table. So, Mr. Reed, CEO, board meetings, market acquisitions, not exactly the profile of a guy just passing through town? Jonathan met her gaze, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. You make it sound like I was hiding something. Were you? She asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. He considered the question. Not exactly, I just didn't think it mattered. Yesterday you met me as a father with a missing daughter. That was the truth. The rest, it's just what I do for a living. Sophia studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe that. You don't strike me as the kind of man who leaves his work behind easily. I don't, he admitted. But here I've been trying to. He paused, then added, You made it easier yesterday. Her expression softened, but only slightly. It's just, people like you don't usually end up in cafes like this unless they're looking for something. I guess I'm wondering what you're looking for. Jonathan didn't answer right away, partly because he didn't know, and partly because Lily had returned to the table, crumbs of pie clinging to her fingers. He smiled faintly, grateful for the interruption. Sophia stepped back, but not before Jonathan caught the way her eyes lingered on him for a beat longer than necessary. There was no hostility there, only a cautious curiosity, as if she was trying to fit this new piece of information into the picture she'd formed of him. As they left the cafe a few minutes later, Jonathan glanced over his shoulder. Sophia was behind the counter again, laughing at something a customer said, but there was a trace of thoughtfulness in her face. And Jonathan knew without question that their paths weren't done crossing, because now she knew who he was, and for some reason, he wanted her to see more than just the man in the suit. The weather shifted that afternoon, clouds rolling in from the coast and dimming the bright spring light that had filled the morning. Jonathan had taken Lily to the old beach house, but the visit had been shorter than he expected. The place was exactly as he remembered it. Weathered white siding, seagrass swaying in the wind, but standing there brought back more memories than he was ready to share with his daughter. They returned to the town earlier than planned, and as they passed the cafe, Jonathan saw Sophia through the rain-streaked window, balancing a tray while chatting with a table of tourists. Without quite thinking about it, he parked and suggested to Lily that they stop in. The cafe was quieter than the day before, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with something warm and spiced. Apple cider, maybe. Jonathan ordered for them both, and Sophia brought over steaming mugs and a plate of scones. She seemed genuinely pleased to see them again, though there was still that subtle watchfulness in her gaze, as if she were trying to understand him beyond the headlines she might have read. It was just after they'd settled into easy conversation that the commotion started. A crash came from the far side of the cafe, ceramic shattering, a chair scraping violently against the floor. Jonathan turned quickly to see an older man, gray-haired and slumped over his table, his coffee spilling across the surface. The people at nearby tables froze, unsure of what to do. Sophia was moving before anyone else, dropping her tray and rushing toward him. "Call an ambulance!" she shouted over her shoulder. Jonathan was already on his feet, striding after her. The man's breathing was ragged, his face pale and damp with sweat. Sophia knelt beside him, her voice steady and calm. "Sir, can you hear me?" When he didn't respond, she checked his pulse and then looked up at Jonathan. "Help me get him flat on the floor." Together, they eased the man down, Jonathan supporting his shoulders while Sophia guided his legs. She tilted his head back to open the airway, then began chest compressions with firm, practiced rhythm. Jonathan knelt beside her, watching her movements, the tension in his chest tightening with each beat. The room was silent except for Sophia's voice counting under her breath and the faint hum of the espresso machine still running behind the counter. Jonathan could see the strain in her arms, the concentration etched into her brow, but she didn't falter. A minute later, the man coughed weakly, his eyelids fluttering. Relief rippled through the room, and Sophia guided him carefully onto his side. The paramedics arrived within moments, taking over and thanking Sophia for her quick action. She brushed it off with a modest nod, but Jonathan saw the way her hands trembled slightly now that the danger had passed. When the crowd began to disperse, Jonathan followed her to the corner where she was washing her hands. "That was incredible," he said quietly. She glanced at him, still a little pale. "It's not the first time I've had to step in. My mom was a nurse. I learned a lot from her." "Still," he said, "you didn't hesitate." You knew exactly what to do. Sophia shrugged, her eyes flicking toward the window where rain still fell in fine sheets. Sometimes you don't have the luxury of thinking too much. You just act. Jonathan studied her for a moment, seeing her in a new light, not just the capable, grounded woman who'd returned his daughter, but someone who could meet crisis head-on without losing her composure. There was a strength there that resonated with him, one he recognized because he'd had to cultivate his own version of it over years of leading people through high-stakes decisions. Lily, oblivious to the tension that had just filled the room, came over with a scone in her hand. "Daddy, can Sophia come with us to the beach tomorrow?" she asked brightly. Jonathan looked at Sophia, catching a flicker of surprise in her expression. "That depends," he said, his voice low but warm. "Would you?" Sophia hesitated, then smiled. "Maybe I will." And in that moment, Jonathan realized that whatever boundaries had existed between them when they'd first met were starting to dissolve, washed away not by charm or chance, but by moments that revealed exactly who they were when it mattered. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the storm having blown itself out overnight. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, and the gulls' cries carried over the rooftops of the little town. Jonathan was surprised when Sophia actually appeared at the beach, walking down the narrow wooden steps from the bluff above. She wore a light sweater over rolled-up jeans, her dark hair loose and stirred by the breeze. Lily spotted her first. "Sophia!" she called, dropping the seashell she had been examining and running toward her with a child's unfiltered enthusiasm. Sophia laughed, crouching to catch her in a hug. "You've been busy already," she said, glancing at the small pile of shells Lily had gathered near a driftwood log. Jonathan approached more slowly, his hands in the pockets of his jacket. "Wasn't sure you'd take us up on the invitation," he said when he reached her. Sophia shrugged lightly, though there was a faint smile on her lips. "You don't get many perfect beach mornings around here this time of year. Seemed ashamed to waste it." They settled into a natural rhythm almost immediately. Lily darted ahead, collecting treasures from the tide line and proudly showing each one to Sophia, who listened and asked questions as if every shell was a priceless find. Jonathan watched from a short distance, his expression softening. Seeing his daughter so at ease with someone outside their tiny circle was rare, and it struck him how easily Sophia seemed to understand her. After a while, they reached the south shore, a quiet stretch of sand Sophia had mentioned before. Here the water lapped gently at the edge, and the breeze was calmer. Lily kicked off her shoes and ran toward the waves, squealing as the cold water splashed her ankles. Jonathan and Sophia lingered back, standing side by side. "She's happy here," Sophia observed, her gaze following the little girl. "She doesn't open up to people quickly," Jonathan said, glancing at her. "You're an exception." Sophia met his eyes briefly before looking away toward the horizon. "Kids can tell when someone's really listening. I think that's all she needed." They walked along the water's edge, the conversation meandering from small talk about the town to stories from their past. Jonathan told her about the early days of his company, the long hours and near failures, and how he'd promised his wife they'd make time for the little things once the business was stable. "We didn't get as much time as we thought," he admitted quietly. Sophia's voice was gentle when she replied, "That's why you're here now, to make up for what was lost." He nodded, and for a moment they walked in silence, the sound of the surf filling the space between them. When they stopped near a cluster of rocks, Sophia climbed up onto one and sat, watching Lily build a sandcastle a few yards away. Jonathan joined her, the sun warming his back. "You don't talk about yourself much," he said after a while. "Not really. There's not much to tell," she replied with a faint smile. "I grew up here, went to school here. My aunt taught me how to run the cafe. It's a good life. Simple. And you're happy with that?" She tilted her head, considering. "Most days, yes. But sometimes I wonder what else is out there. Not in a restless way, just a curiosity." Jonathan studied her profile in the sunlight. "You could go anywhere, do anything." "Maybe," she said, her eyes still on the water. "But I think where you are matters less than who you're with." The words lingered between them, carried by the wind. Jonathan didn't push the moment further, but he felt something shift, a subtle narrowing of the distance he'd kept since they met. When they finally turned back toward town, Lily ran ahead again, clutching her bucket of shells. Sophia fell into step beside him, and without thinking, Jonathan brushed his hand lightly against hers. She didn't pull away. It was a small thing, almost nothing at all, but as they walked, he knew it was the first step towards something he wasn't sure he'd been ready for. Until now. 2 days after their morning at the beach, the rhythm of Jonathan's visit to the town had settled into something almost domestic. Mornings with Lily at the beach or park, afternoons wandering through the market or visiting the cafe, evenings back at the rented beach house with the sound of the waves drifting in through the windows. It was a pace he wasn't used to, slower, quieter, but one he had begun to crave. Sophia had become part of it without him even realizing how naturally she fit. That afternoon, the cafe was busier than usual. A tour bus had stopped in town, and the line at the counter stretched nearly to the door. Sophia was behind the register, moving quickly, her dark hair pinned back, her focus absolute. Jonathan sat at a corner table with Lily, watching her work while they shared a slice of pie. He noticed things now that he hadn't before. How she remembered regular customers' names, how she caught details others would miss, how she managed to make every person feel like they had her full attention, even in the chaos. The noise of clinking cups and conversation was abruptly broken by a sharp, pained gasp from across the room. Jonathan's head snapped toward the sound and saw an older woman, seated alone near the window, clutching her chest. Her face had gone pale, her lips parted as if struggling for air. Before Jonathan could even process it, Sophia was already moving, sliding out from behind the counter, weaving through tables, and dropping to her knees beside the woman. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. Jonathan was on his feet and at her side within seconds. Lily stayed at their table, her eyes wide, sensing the seriousness in her father's expression. Sophia looked up briefly, locking eyes with him. "Call for an ambulance," she said, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. Jonathan pulled his phone from his pocket and relayed their location to emergency services as Sophia assessed the woman's condition. "She's having chest pain," Sophia explained quickly when he returned to her side. "Her pulse is weak. We need to keep her calm until help arrives." The cafe had gone silent except for Sophia's voice as she coached the woman to take slow breaths, one hand steady on her shoulder. Jonathan crouched nearby, offering quiet reassurance while keeping an eye on the door for the paramedics. Minutes stretched longer than they should have, but Sophia never faltered. She kept speaking, her voice even and unwavering, as if willing the woman to hold on just a little longer. When the sound of sirens finally reached them, Jonathan felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. The paramedics burst through the door, and Sophia gave a concise, precise report before stepping back. The woman was loaded onto a stretcher, and the crowd began to disperse. Jonathan remained by Sophia's side as the ambulance pulled away, the red lights fading into the distance. "You didn't hesitate," he said quietly once they were alone in the corner of the cafe. Sophia gave a small shrug, though her eyes betrayed a hint of the adrenaline still running through her. "There's no time to think in moments like that. You just do what you can." Jonathan looked at her for a long moment, seeing her not just as the woman who had helped his daughter or walked the beach with them, but as someone who was unshakable when it counted. Someone he wanted in his life for more than fleeting moments. Lily, still at their table, piped up softly, "Daddy, is she okay?" Jonathan turned to her, his voice gentle. "She's on her way to the hospital, sweetheart. She's going to get help now." Then he looked back at Sophia. "You were that help before anyone else could be." There was a weight in his words that made Sophia's gaze soften, though she said nothing in response. Instead, she returned to the counter, and Jonathan followed her with his eyes, a realization settling in with absolute clarity. She wasn't just part of these days in the small town. She had become essential to them. And to him. The evening after the incident at the cafe, the town felt quieter than usual. The streets were washed in the warm glow of sunset, and the air carried the faint scent of salt and baking bread. Jonathan had walked Lily back to the beach house after dinner, but he couldn't shake the image of Sophia kneeling beside that woman, calm and steady as the world held its breath. It wasn't just that she had acted quickly. It was the way she made people feel safe. He knew he needed to see her, to say what he'd been holding back for days. Lily was already tucked into bed, drifting off with her small hand curled around her favorite stuffed rabbit, when Jonathan stepped outside. The air was cool against his face as he made his way through the winding streets toward the cafe. Through the window, he saw Sophia cleaning the counter, her hair loose now, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. The last customers had gone, leaving the space dim and quiet except for the low hum of the fridge. When he opened the door, the bell above it chimed softly, and Sophia glanced up, her expression brightening in surprise. "You're here late," she said, setting down the cloth. "I didn't want the day to end without talking to you," Jonathan replied, his voice low but sure. He walked toward her, his hands in his jacket pockets, trying to gather the right words. She tilted her head slightly curious. "About what?" He stopped a few feet from her, the muted lamplight casting warm shadows across her face. "About you. About what you've done for me. For Lily." He paused, letting the weight of his thoughts settle before speaking again. "When we came here, I thought it was just about giving my daughter a connection to her mother's past. I didn't expect to find this." Sophia's brow furrowed slightly. "This? You," he said simply. "The way you found Lily that day, how you made her feel safe, how you made me feel like I wasn't failing her in that moment. And since then, you've been there. Not because you had to, not because of who I am, but because you wanted to. You've made this place feel like home in a way I didn't think was possible anymore." Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak, and Jonathan stepped closer, his voice softening. "I've spent years building walls, thinking it was the only way to protect myself and my daughter. But you've been breaking them down without even trying. Lily trusts you. I trust you. And I don't want that to end when we leave here." Sophia's eyes searched his, her expression a mixture of surprise and something warmer, something that mirrored the hope he felt in his chest. "Jonathan," she began, then stopped, her voice faltering for a moment. She glanced toward the empty tables as if steadying herself, then met his gaze again. "I didn't plan for any of this either. But you and Lily, you've become part of my days in a way I didn't see coming. I care about you both. More than I should, maybe, for how short a time it's been." He took another step, close enough now that he could see the faint freckles across her cheeks. "Then maybe we don't overthink it. Maybe we see where this goes. Together." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant crash of waves outside. Then Sophia's mouth curved into a small, genuine smile. "Together," she agreed, her voice quiet but certain. Jonathan felt something ease inside him, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying since the day his wife died. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, their fingers lacing naturally. They stood like that for a while, the cafe around them bathed in the soft golden light of closing time, the world outside shrinking to just the two of them. When he finally walked her home, the streets were empty, and the moonlight cast silver patterns across the cobblestones. At her door, she leaned against the frame, looking at him with a mix of shyness and something far deeper. "Good night, Jonathan," she said softly. "Good night, Sophia," he replied, and for the first time in years he felt certain that this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a chapter he hadn't dared to imagine, but now couldn't wait to live. To me, the ending of this story is a perfect example of how real connections often come from the most unexpected places. Jonathan arrived in that small town focused on the past, on giving Lily a piece of her mother's memory, never realizing that the future he'd been afraid to imagine was waiting for him there. Sophia's role goes far beyond being the woman who returned his daughter that first day. She becomes a safe place for both Jonathan and Lily, not because of grand gestures, but through quiet constancy, small acts of care, and the ability to see the man beneath the CEO title. Their relationship grows organically, built on trust, gratitude, and shared moments rather than rushed romance. What makes the ending satisfying is that it feels earned. Jonathan doesn't just find love. He learns to let someone into his life without fear of losing control, and Sophia finds a new horizon beyond the familiar rhythm of her small-town life. It's not a fairy tale built on instant magic, but a partnership shaped by real trials and choices. For me, it's a reminder that sometimes the family you need most finds you when you're not looking, and that love built in everyday moments can be stronger than anything you could plan.